Welcome to our next session of the Human Security and Development Forum. First of all, I would like to welcome our guest, Mr. Lukas Mandl, who is a member of the European Parliament. And I will introduce him a little bit closer a bit later on. But first of all, I would like to give the word to Professor Lee Eun-jung, who is the head of the Korean Studies Department at Free University Berlin and also head of the Korea Europe Center, which is organizing this event. Please, Professor Lee, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Teresa. I'm very delighted to have today's Human Security and Development Forum events on the issue of the role of the European Parliamentary Diplomacy for the Peace of Korean Peninsula. And since 2020, the Korea Europe Center at the Institute of Korean Studies of Freie Universität Berlin has been preparing this Human Security and Development Forum related to policy issues on Korean Peninsula. And this year, we had a fruitful discussions focusing on the EU-Korea relations with Federica Mogherini and Michael Reiterer, a lady. And today, which is the third event of the second year of Korea Europe Center, we are very privileged to have Lukas Mandl, the chair of the European Parliament's delegation for relations with Korean Peninsula, as speaker. And what is the role for European parliamentary diplomacy on the Korean Peninsula? And how can the European Parliament promote deepening the partnership between Brussels and Seoul, particularly in the light of COVID-19 pandemic? And what are the ways in which the delegation can contribute to improving the security situation on the Korean Peninsula and engagement with Pyongyang? Those were the questions which we asked him. And I would like to thank Mr. Mandl that he accepted our invitation today. And I would like to offer my special thanks to the KDI School of Public Policy and Management, our partner for Korea Europe Center. Our Human Security and Development Forum is made possible by the generous grant from the KDI School of Public Policy and Management. And I would like to thank Teresa Novotna and Daniela Klaus-Kim and our staff who are working so hard through the last 2 years to organize many policy events that generated critical discussions. Now, I'll turn over the mic to Teresa. Okay, thank you.
So thank you very much for those kind words. I would like to add that this is not only a third edition of the Human Security and Development Forum. It is also third occasion that we have, let's say, another EU institution which is dealing with foreign policy and Korean Peninsula. As Eun-jung Lee mentioned, we had Federica Mogherini and Ambassador Reiterer, which are representative of the diplomatic branch. But today we welcome Mr. Mandl as representative of another institution in Brussels, European Parliament. So maybe next time we should have someone from member states to have a sort of balance of all the players in Brussels. The European Parliament is really interesting in terms of foreign policy, because on one hand, it is the only directly elected body among all the EU institutions. But on the other hand, at least at the formal level, and I would like to emphasize at the formal level, it doesn't have any direct powers in terms of foreign policy. And yet, I would say, I think it is sort of the cool kid, if I can put it this way, among all the players, because the role of the European Parliament has been increasing over time quite significantly and quite steadily. And therefore, also the role of the European parliamentary diplomacy has been increasing. And therefore, it is a great honor and great pleasure to have Mr. Mandl as a member of the European Parliament to tell us more how the European parliamentary diplomacy works in practice and also how it works in relationship to the Korean Peninsula. So I will say a few words about Mr. Mandl. Lukas Mandl is the chair of the European Parliament's delegation for relations with the Korean Peninsula as a whole, so both with the south and north since 2020, but he has many other very interesting roles in the European Parliament. He's a member of AFET, which is a committee on foreign affairs, vice chair of the subcommittee on security and defense, but he also serves on justice and employment committees, and also since last year on the special committee on foreign interference in all the democratic processes in the European Union. And I should also add that he is also a member of another delegation to Bosnia and Kosovo. But it's not his first term in the European Parliament. He served already before. Mr. Mandl is an Austrian politician from ÖVP, which is part of the European People's Party group, EPP, which is the largest group in the European Parliament. But before, he was very much involved in Austrian politics in the regional parliament of Lower Austria and chair of its Committee on European Affairs. So I'm really pleased that Mr. Mandl accepted this invitation. Also, we had the chance to meet virtually at other occasions, so I'm very happy that this time around we have proper time to speak, to have a debate. And before we do so, I would give the floor to Mr. Mandl to have the introductory lecture about the role of the European diplomacy. So if I may, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the invite. Thanks for the kind introduction. And thanks for drawing the attention on this important issue, important for Europe, for both South Korea and North Korea, for the whole Korean Peninsula, as well as for the world, I would say. Professor Lee and Teresa Nowotna and the whole Korea-Europe Center at Free University Berlin are of utmost importance, let's say, for reflection on the current state of play based on history and future perspectives. And I highly appreciate that you obviously intend to address the different various European EU institutions regarding the Korean Peninsula and related issues, because this structural question is of utmost importance to understand the whole process. There are some specifics, like Teresa Nowotna has already mentioned, there is even no formal competence of European Parliament on foreign affairs. But anyway, in many different cases, European Parliament is faster, quicker, and more clear, more clarified in its foreign policy issues and positions, and member states follow them. We would be more than happy, vast majority in European Parliament, if member states would be quick as well, and if the so-called anonymity in the Council regarding foreign affairs issues and several other issues would end with the new EU treaty, and we would have majority decisions also on foreign policy. Having said that, one of the specifics is that the European Parliament is the only EU institution with formal contacts with North Korea. And since I'm a parliamentarian, not a professional diplomat, even not an academic in that field you are working on, I have the privilege each and every day to act on behalf of the citizens. That's what parliamentarians do if they do a proper job, of the citizens of their constituencies, of the citizens of Europe. And that's why, let's say, strengthening ties, building bridges, connect between even entities with very different positions on many issues is part of, I would say, a proper parliamentary job. And that's what we try to do with North Korea. I have served as the head of this delegation since the beginning of 2020, so a little more than a year now. And I've experienced, and before I come to facts and figures, I want to share some experience regarding that work. I have experienced huge interest, even curiosity, I would say, in, let's say, I would call it just courtesy talks with North Korean officials. This is one of my lessons that since we, the European Parliament, and I'm acting on behalf of the European Parliament as head of this delegation, are in a very special role since we have formal contacts and we are the only institution with formal contacts here. And so we can use it. This is a leverage, this interest, this curiosity from the Western world, from CNN downwards, that's what it is about, is also has the meaning of a leverage opportunity to change things and maybe to contribute and maybe also to freedom in the future. But this is a long path ahead. But let's move to South Korea, which is an absolute success story when it comes to the relations between South Korea and the EU, when it comes to the development of South Korea that has taken place in the last decades, and when it comes to South Korea's role on a geopolitical landscape. I would say South Korea is the EU 8th largest export destination for goods, whereas the EU is South Korea's 3rd largest export market. South Korea shares our democratic values and our commitment to human rights, the rule of law and market economy. The Republic of Korea is one of only 10 strategic partners of the EU, and it is the only country in the world that has a political as well as an economic as well as a security agreement with the European Union. We should keep that in mind. It's about economy, but it's by far not only about economy. It's about values, it's about security, and it's about, let's say, a common political view when it comes to geopolitical issues. The political partnership encompasses a wide range of issues such as human rights, counterterrorism, climate change, energy security, and development assistance. The bilateral free trade agreement with South Korea was the first trade deal signed by the EU with an Asian country. And I can share with you, especially as a European, and I guess not all of you, but many of you are maybe German. We discuss a lot in the public, sometimes in a populistic way, about free trade agreements, economic agreements of whatever kind, generally investment agreements. But we have these sometimes populistic discussions rather more with other parts of the world than when we negotiate or finish agreements with Asian countries, and is a positive sign. And South Korea was the very first of all the Asian free trade agreements. And it's a success story since EU exports of goods to South Korea increased by 77% from 2020 to 2018 in only 8 years. Trade with Korea creates jobs in Europe and will be important to overcome the economic consequences of the pandemic. The EU and South Korea have also signed a crisis management participation agreement. This agreement allows South Korea to participate in EU international peacekeeping missions. South Korea has, for example, provided support to the EU's counter-piracy operation in Somalia. South Korea can be a successful role model in business and research, but also in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. That is why I have organized several webinars with South Korean officials in order to learn from their experience. I myself have to keep in mind and must not forget about the very beginning of the pandemic and the processes and actions that have been taken that time. And a major part of that, also on behalf of the Korea delegation in European Parliament, was to convey the experiences and the approach to solutions and so on by South Korea as an important example of dealing with this awful virus. And this meant a lot, especially in the beginning. We all have learned a lot during this pandemic. We have learned about masks and about vaccines and about keeping distance and about so many things. And we must not forget about the lessons South Koreans told us before, because they knew earlier, or they were pretty quick in the proper response in the beginning. And I'm happy that we could, let's say, profit from friendship and positive contact with South Korea. The fight against climate change is another area where EU and South Korea can work together and set global standards. Like the EU, South Korea has very ambitious targets. Last year, it pledged to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. The role of the European Parliament's delegation is to maintain and intensify contacts with our South Korean counterparts. Unfortunately, this was not easy during the pandemic due to the travel restrictions, but we can hopefully resume our mutual visits very soon. The delegation can also raise awareness among the public to the important role of South Korea. While the EU has excellent political, economic and security relations with South Korea, the relationship with North Korea is of a totally different kind. North Korea is not just a threat to South Korea, which 70 years after the outbreak of the Korean War is technically still at war with the North, but despite the geographical distance, also to the European Union. An escalation of tensions on the Korean Peninsula would also affect us in Europe. As already stated, South Korea is the EU's 8th largest trading partner, with particular importance in information technology and the health sector, so a conflict would certainly impact our economies. North Korea has reached a stage where it has the capacity to launch a nuclear-armed intercontinental ballistic missile, capable of hitting anywhere in Europe, North America, or Australia. In addition, North Korea's nuclear weapons program also undermines the global nuclear non-proliferation regime and threatens to further destabilize volatile regions such as the Middle East, where North Korea has transferred missile technology in the past. The EU's official policy towards North Korea, and we have already heard that by Professor Lee, is one of critical engagement. This policy combines pressure through sanctions and other measures while keeping communication and dialogue channels open. This is also what I understand as the possible European approach, not to be naive when main elementary values like human dignity and freedom are harmed, which takes place and has been taking place for decades by the North Korean regime, but to seek cooperation. That doesn't mean to accept things, that doesn't mean not to fight against these violations, but to keep channels of communication open. The EU goals are, let's say, to share the list of EU goals with you: denuclearization, lasting reduction of tensions on the Korean Peninsula and in the region, upholding of the global non-proliferation regime, and improvement of the human rights situation in the DPRK. The EU's policy of critical engagement has three main components: sanctions, humanitarian aid provision, and dialogue. Sanctions, humanitarian aid provision, and dialogue are the three pillars this critical engagement policy of EU stands on. Let's go deeper into these three pillars. The EU has implemented UN Security Council resolutions as well as autonomous sanctions that go beyond the UN-based sanctions. These restrictive measures mostly target the DPRK's nuclear-related, other weapons of mass destruction-related, and ballistic missile-related programs. A number of people and entities that have been linked to these illegal programs are subject to travel restrictions and asset freeze, both by the UN and autonomously by the EU. Other restrictions also apply in the broader domains of trade, investment, transport, and financial services. When it comes to humanitarian aid, the EU has provided more than 135.7 million euros in humanitarian aid since 1995 to support over 130 projects. The aid focuses on providing food assistance, the improvement of health services, and access to clean water and sanitation to the most vulnerable populations. According to the UN, more than 43% of North Korea's population of 25 million are undernourished, have limited access to basic services, and are in need of humanitarian assistance. North Korea was also offered 2 million doses of corona vaccine through the COVAX program, to which the EU is the biggest donor. And when it comes to the dialogue, the EU and the DPRK established diplomatic relations in 2001. However, the EU has no delegation in the DPRK. Its local representation is ensured by one of the 6 member states: Bulgaria, Czech Republic, Germany, Poland, Romania, and Sweden. These states have resident embassies in the country. Between 1998 and 2015, the EU has held 14 sessions of political dialogue with Pyongyang. However, since 2015, no meetings have taken place. The European Parliament is currently the only institution that is officially visiting North Korea. As already mentioned, I had planned to go to Pyongyang in May 2020, but this could not happen due to the pandemic. Therefore, parliamentary diplomacy is even more important. So what I would call parliamentary diplomacy, what I have tried to stress in the beginning, what I mean with that. While in theory, Critical engagement should encompass both sanctions and engagement. In recent years, the focus has been primarily on sanctions. This has led to a diminished role for the EU. While the leaders of the US, China, and Russia have all talked to North Korea, the EU has had no official communication with North Korea since 2015. As a result, the EU has often been sidelined in negotiations. Therefore, I believe that the EU's policy of critical engagement should be revisited and dialogue be resumed. It is important to underline that the opening of communication channels is not a reward, very important. It's not a reward for anybody, but a necessary condition for effective diplomacy. So nobody on this planet, in media, in the Western world, wherever, in North Korea itself, should misunderstand Europeans seeking for cooperation and dialogue and critical engagement as a reward for anything, because there is nothing to be rewarded in this regime and under this regime. It also does not mean giving up on pressure. Sanctions can and should remain in place until the international community decides to start removing them, but sanctions should go hand in hand with diplomacy. With such a revised approach, the EU could play a larger role when it comes to the denuclearization. The EU could play a role as facilitator, party, and guarantor of a diplomatically negotiated agreement. The EU has a higher credibility in this area than any other player, not least because of its ongoing support for the JCPOA with Iran, despite the withdrawal of the US under the former administration. The EU has also the advantage of being geographically remote and having less direct interests in the DPRK issue, contrary to states like Japan, USA, China, or Russia. The European Parliament, and especially the delegation for relations with the Korean Peninsula, can be a driving force in this regard. Another focus should be placed on fostering people-to-people contacts. For instance, by supporting academic exchanges, it is important to change the perception of North Koreans regarding the world outside and to provide them with modern education materials. Yeah, maybe while concluding these initial remarks, let me share with you one thought, also a lesson for me during this 1.5 years of work on this issue yet. 2 months ago around, I had a discussion on reunification. And in the first place, I wanted to refuse to accept the invite because it sounded naive to me, given the current situation, to talk about reunification. But two things convinced me to participate and also to be willing to, let's say, reflect not only on practical steps forward, but also on visions. And the two things were coming from two experts. The one said nobody had expected Germany to reunify until 1989. So I was 10 years old then, but I even remember what was happening in our neighbor countries, which became one neighbor country then. And the other thing that convinced me was the historical dimension. This was one people for hundreds and thousands of years, actually, the Koreans. So let's say, be practical, let's work hard. Let's not never be naive on anything, but let's also draw the picture of possible visions on the wall. Maybe that's also a part of motivation to properly work forward on a daily basis. Thank you for your interest so far.
So thank you very much, Mr. Mandl, for very direct and very honest take both on South Korea and North Korea and sort of drawing the distinctions between the two. I would now like to open a discussion where everyone is invited to ask questions. To give everyone a bit of time to ask, I would first start maybe with what we talked about at the very beginning. I'm sure there will be lots of questions about, as you said, the curiosity about your role in terms of the relations with the DPRK. But maybe at the beginning, I would just like to ask more about actually the Parliament's work in terms of EU foreign policy in general and let's say the delegations' work as well. how does it, what do you do, let's say, on day-to-day basis? Of course, people can follow different parliamentary resolutions, but, how does it relate to the diplomatic side of things? I think I mentioned also that you are also a member of the delegation with Bosnia and Kosovo. So perhaps if you can draw some comparison between, that delegation and your work and the fact that you chair the delegation for the Korean Peninsula. Obviously, we are here much more of experts on the Korean Peninsula, but it might be interesting to hear how things work in practice. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, the foreign policy of European Parliament, as everything in parliaments, follows parliamentary majorities. As already mentioned, is quicker and faster than usually the member states in the Council are. But in the first place, in real life, in practical daily political life, the Council and the Commission at least listen carefully to the Parliament and what the Parliament has to state regarding foreign policy. Secondly, what I have called parliamentary diplomacy is an important factor of European parliaments and EU foreign policy, because South Korea, for example, has a parliament which can be called a parliament because it's consisting of elected members. Other parts of the world don't have a parliament, or don't have a parliament that deserves to be named as a parliament. But as far as there are parliaments on this planet, we can talk on behalf of people to other people who talk on behalf of their people. That's what parliamentary diplomacy is about. It's usually a language that's clearer, and it's usually more related to practical issues and maybe less related to, let's call it, ideologies or nationalism or ethnical tensions or whatever it might be, because usually the vast majority of people who we have the privilege to represent expect practical solutions for proper living, proper dwelling, peace, freedom, and mutual relations. So that's what the European Parliament usually does. When it comes to, maybe that's a third point, to concrete issues, the various fields, geographical fields, are different. So we have talked about the Korean Peninsula today, and I'm also engaged as the head of the Transatlantic Friends of Israel, which is a multi-partisan group and interparliamentary group of lawmakers from all over Europe. And the Middle East issues are very much different than the Korean Peninsula issues. Anyway, EU is demanded to, let's say, convey a clear position when it comes, as it has been in the last weeks, to questions between civilization and terrorism, between a state and its civilian people on the one side and terrorists on the other side. But also in beyond security issues, when it comes to economy, to people exchange, to academic exchange, to innovation, there are a lot of opportunities we can seek out and use. And as you have addressed the Bosnia-Kosovo delegation, this is again very different, because these countries, as well as the four other Western Balkan countries, Albania, Serbia, North Macedonia, Montenegro, these countries are candidate countries, or at least the future candidate countries. So they are European. They have populations that feel very European, feel European identity, sometimes more than populations of today's EU member states. And they are also, because of their geographical state, very important for Europe. Because other parts of the world who do not share the values the EU represent and who seek confrontation against the EU sometimes, like Turkey, like China, like Russia, like Saudi Arabia, like the Emirates, and others, are highly influential in this region. And we want to encourage and empower the people of the 6 Western Balkan states in order to, let's say, follow their European destiny and work hard on reforms in rule of law, anti-corruption, anti-organized crime, but not only solving problems, but also creating new opportunities and fields of economy. Especially, I have always on my mind, and I follow that path in the information technology digitalization sector, because the people are very young, especially in Kosovo, but also in the other countries. Kosovo is the youngest country of Europe when it comes to the average age. It's also the youngest state of Europe, by the way, but it's also a country with a very young population, working hard, seeking for education, seeking opportunities all over the planet, and especially within Europe. So these are some concrete issues we work on in that field. Maybe one structural point when it comes to foreign policy in European Parliament, one or two. The one is with regard to the EEAS, the European External Action Service, which I highly appreciate. This is an entity of utmost importance for European foreign relations, but the resources are by far too little. EEAS needs two things, in my view, and that's what I work on the longer range: more resources, more personnel, more relations, more opportunities for relations and for activities in many different fields. Secondly, it must be on the long run connected to the European Parliament. I highly appreciate the German expression, the German term of about the German Bundeswehr, the German military, as a parliamentary army. That's what the Germans call their army, parliamentary army. I highly appreciate that, because there is a lot of meaning in it. The meaning is this army is acting on behalf of people and on behalf of regular people. To act on behalf of regular people always means to seek peace, to seek opportunities for proper dwelling, far away from any kind of aggression or whatever it might be. Parliamentary army, and the ES should be a parliamentary diplomatic arm entity. And this is not yet the case, of course. It's more related to the European Commission and to the Council. And that's the one field of structure. And the other field is, as I'm also a member of the Committee Against Disinformation and Other Foreign Interference into European Democracies. We have this special committee that is meant to run until March next year and deals with disinformation and other means and measures of foreign interference from Russia, but also from Turkey and from non-state actors, terrorist groups, and so on. They all have together that they want to split and divide Europe. Because I always convey this view, at least from my side, because it's really hard to understand what it's all about, because it happens each and every day, but it's happening hidden, and we have, let's say, to figure out what the aim, the target of these aggressions might be. And it's always, no matter whether it comes from this or that source, it's always division. Divisions like it happened with Brexit, divisions like it happens within our societies each and every day, divisions like it happened during the pandemic in many different respects in our societies, unfortunately. So unity is, again, the answer to this kind of aggression. Why do I say that? Because in my view, and this is now the first time I convey this view from my side with, let's say, a public auditorium or a larger auditorium outside the parliament, let's say. In my view, this special committee must become a permanent committee. Not only against disinformation, but it could be called against terrorism, it could be called counterintelligence, but because we have to be aware of the fact that we are a target of intelligence and disinformation and hybrid warfare. Hybrid warfare would again be an issue for another talk. We're a target, but we are not that much an actor. So I don't want to be an actor on the side of confrontation and aggression, but the European Union has to be and must be an actor in defending itself on behalf of the people, and also on behalf of the values the EU represent on a global scale. So these are beyond what I have already mentioned regarding anonymity in the Council. When it comes to foreign affairs, these are some, let's say, more technical but important structural ideas for future dealing with foreign policy in European Parliament.
Right. Thank you very much. We've already got quite a few questions. As you can imagine, lots of them are related to the EP's work with North Korea or towards North Korea. But there's one question which is more also related to the functioning of the European Parliament, a question by Henrik Johannemann, whether there are different views on how to deal with the Korean Peninsula based on different party in the European Parliament or different groups. So does, say, your group have different views than Social Democrats and Liberals and so on? And how does it affect the work of your delegation, or if there is, multi-partisan basis, how do you cooperate with members of different groups in your delegation?
Thank you. As in most cases, not in each and every case, but in most cases in foreign policy, it's not that partisan as in other political fields in European Parliament, especially in the delegation of the Korean Peninsula. I do not experience that much of party tensions when it comes to content and positions. It's rather more, let's say, a distinction between approaches of different member states. Then in a minor way also by parliamentarians coming from these member states. As I have mentioned, on European level, EU institution level, the European Parliament is the only institution with formal contact to North Korea. Of course, there are member states with very intensive contact to North Korea. There are others with nearly no contact with North Korea, and there may be different views on some things, but generally I have the privilege in that field to work on something where the EU is even more unified than in many, many other political fields. That's really something I can convey to you.
Thank you. So now I would probably take a block of questions related to especially North Korea. Maybe to start with sort of more people-to-people context, this is how you ended your talk. First of all, what could be the role of the European Parliament, how to foster the people-to-people contact? And the second question is related to my university experience. There was a visit by North Korean students early last year, which is part of exchange of letters of intent for cooperation between Free University of Berlin and Kim Il-sung University, so the main university in North Korea. But yet recently this has been criticized by an article in Deutsche Welle, where basically the point was that the German universities, not just ours, but also Humboldt University and also University in Prague, could be instrumentalized for propaganda by North Korean government, despite the fact that the visit did not break UN security sanctions, as it was confirmed. So, what do you think in general about, let's say, people-to-people exchanges? How could this be done? How the European Parliament, how your delegation could contribute to that? And once these contacts happen, then they actually get criticized, right? So how to deal with this situation more broadly?
Well, thank you. This question is nearly a philosophical question, I would say, but I'm happy to share my view on it. We need even more confidence in the strength of our structures of democracy and rule of law and freedom and human dignity-based society, because then we understand that maybe we influence other parts of the world in a positive way, And I really mean in a positive way, not in an influential, overwhelming way, in a positive way via the values we represent. And we must not think, we have to think about it, but we must not be misled by the idea we could be influenced as well by others. We must not be naive. We should not forget about the fact that people who visit us from systems like the one in North Korea are, for whatever reason, within their systems at home, privileged. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able and allowed to visit Berlin, Freie Universität Berlin, whatever. So this is something we should have on our minds when we talk, when we exchange, when we reflect on things, but also use this opportunity to share our experience. The history of Europe is bloody, 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 as we all know. We have learned our lessons in a very, very difficult, harmful, violent way. So we should not present ourselves as we would be the better people, but we owe generations before us in Europe a proper system of cooperation, of mutual understanding, and then of peace and freedom and proper dwelling and welfare. And this is the example we can provide the world with. And this is why I highly appreciate each and every opportunity for exchange. And when it's affected in the way I tried to present it with you now, I guess it's for the better of the world and the involved people, at least.
Right. Yes. And in terms of context between the delegation and I assume more the official institutions in the DPRK. You mentioned that you planned a trip May last year, which had to be cancelled. So do you possibly have any, new thoughts when you could visit or possibly host a delegation from the DPRK? Or I seem to remember that you once mentioned at another event that you had a phone conversation with the North Korean ambassador. So, I assume that it's one of the points that, you mentioned the curiosity of people. So obviously we are all curious about that. So yeah, if you can just say a few words about these contacts.
It's very easy to share with you, and I'm very frank and open on that. Representative of North Korea for the EU formerly was the one in London. So as we all know, and also the North Koreans know, London is not anymore an EU capital. And so the new responsible representative for EU from North Korea is in Berlin. Since I'm heading this European Parliament delegation for the Korean Peninsula, we had an introduction call, a courtesy call, so to speak, in fall winter last year. It was nearly without any concrete issue. It was concrete what I conveyed regarding the aims of EU, denuclearization, and the others I have already mentioned today and shared with you. This was clear from my side, but actually the call was very short. The line broke several times. I don't know why. And there was not really a deeper issue. And there was absolutely no content related to the US elections, the new US administration, and other things that were mentioned afterwards as possible issues we would have discussed. But this was not the case. And it was a lesson, and I found it interesting that the curiosity after this call was huge, and I hope to have the opportunity to inform the public, since it's so interested in the future in advance, to talk, because I never hide anything. It's transparent. That's also part of our values, that we work transparently. I transparently share the agenda. I transparent the process. I share the process, and I share transparently the results. this will also be the case if I might have the privilege to be invited, and also feel the obligation, of course, to let's say work happily with South Korea because of these many opportunities and these excellent relations and this success story of the free trade agreement and the other strategic partnership agreements with South Korea. But I also feel the obligation to do my job on behalf of the Europeans and also in the interest of the 25 million inhabitants of North Korea, which also deserve better circumstances via development aid, but also via sanctions, but also via dialogue. All these three pillars are important, and this is the path I will follow.
Yes, well, we are trying here also to, conduct dialogue as much as we can. So that's definitely much appreciated. And I would just say, maybe the phone line has broke just because on the DPRK side it has possibly been led via Pyongyang, but that's just my guess.
You might be right.
Yeah, but all these contexts are much appreciated. There are different questions on the North Korean issue. One is about sanctions. Especially the sanctions that affect living conditions of the ordinary people. So obviously we have the sanctions that they are pretty much aimed at preventing the nuclear development, or all of them should be aimed at that, but some of them affect the ordinary people. So how do you, what's the European Parliament's position on that, or your personal, your delegation's position on this one?
I'm always rather in favor of sanctions targeting concrete persons and not whole economies or the whole population. And I guess that's pretty much in proper place when it comes to North Korea, as well as development aid for the people in North Korea. Here, of course, my deeper look is with regard to the directions the money and the support of whatever kind in North Korea goes to in order to approach the persons who are really in need and not channels which are not meant to receive EU money. But I guess when it comes to North Korea, in other parts of the world, I know a lot of critiques on where the money goes, or where the regular population would be harmed via sanctions, and maybe not the criminals or the responsible persons for whatever harmful activity. But I don't know critiques like that when it comes to North Korea. I guess it's pretty balanced to have sanctions on the very persons which are meant, and to do development aid for the broader population, as in many areas and also on a global scale, EU is the largest contributor to development aid. We should not forget about that. We have to do a lot for progress in the field of hard power as European Union, but we are a world champion in soft power. Both is true. So let's work on that basis and face both of these facts.
Yes. Thank you. There's one more question on North Korea, and maybe then we can move also to the other half of the peninsula. Also, I would encourage everyone, if you have other questions, especially on the South Korean side of things, or maybe more general questions. If you want to ask them, please go ahead. But on the North Korea, there's also a question. You already mentioned the fact that the ambassador who is responsible for the EU is now based in Berlin, used to be in London. And the question is whether there should be an EU representation, or I guess EU delegation established in Pyongyang, and whether the North Korean embassy should be allowed to move to Brussels. What do you think about this? Also, what do you think about resuming the political dialogue, which last time took place in 2015? maybe I may just add that, as far as I know, the problem in terms of moving the DPRK embassy to Brussels is more a question of position of certain member states, especially France. But maybe there's something which the EP could do, or how you could convince your French colleagues to commit their government. What are your views on this specific issue?
I argue always in favor of everything that helps our path of critical engagement. Of course, mutual offices, or let's call it delegations, maybe also in some cases embassies, would help. Of course, this is, let's say, related to reasonable arguments in favor of that. And that's what I always defend and always try to convey as my position also to colleagues from whatever member state ever here in European Parliament. And EU can effect its role as an honest broker, so to speak, its role as a contributor to peace and understanding, and its self-understanding as a power of critical engagement in North Korea even more if mutual offices or delegations would be in place.
Yes. Hopefully, I mean, this was one of the things which I and several of my colleagues have also been arguing, that this would be a good thing to happen. So, maybe next time we need to invite French representatives and try to convince them, especially. There's one more question on North Korea, which is then moving slightly towards South Korea as well, and that's about human rights, but also question of how the current South Korean government has been dealing with human rights, and especially what the Moon administration has done in terms of the politics vis-a-vis the defectors who try to send the leaflets across the border to the DPRK. And there's a new South Korean law which basically bans this activity, and those who do it can face high fines. South Korean defense is that it basically doesn't really impact much the population in the north, while it endangers the South Korean population living in the border regions. While those activists who do it, they just basically say that this is going not only against human rights of the North Koreans, but also human rights of the South Koreans, meaning freedom of speech and expression. So obviously human rights is always high on the EU agenda. It's always high on the European Parliament's agenda. So how would you actually put the human rights into dialogue, and how to also deal with, let's say, the South Korean government has slightly different positions than what, let's say, the Europeans would also like to have?
South Korea is a partner state, as mentioned, in many different respects. And in this case, most importantly, South Korea is a fully fledged democratic system, rule of law based system. So as in each and every other case on this planet, I will not intervene with this or that, maybe not that elaborated opinion on domestic South Korean issues. I'm happy to have colleagues which are properly democratically elected in a true parliament on the South Korean side, and to know South Korea, let's say, on the page of history where human dignity and freedom are defended. And that's my response to that question. I hear everything, I hear your message, but it's a very clear position from my side to do it like that.
Yes. So now we can move a little bit more to the southern side of the peninsula, let's say. And there's a question about dialogue between the European Parliament and South Korea. What are the challenges? I mean, you mentioned the collaboration throughout the pandemic. But let's say what are both the sort of the positive sides of the dialogue, but also maybe those which are not as easy between the South Korean side and the European side?
I'm really not aware of any major problem. I just take my phone just to convey one example to you. It was even yesterday that also the Prime Minister Chancellor of my home country, Sebastian Kurz, has been invited by South Korea to be part of the Seoul P4G summit and by President Moon to meet the challenges of climate change that affects us all and that we must tackle together. And these are many different fields, especially when it comes to my home country, Austria. The government, Prime Minister himself, has announced in summer last year to create strategic partnership agreements with several countries on this planet. One was Switzerland, one was Israel, and one also was South Korea. And this is for many good reasons. Most of them we have already mentioned today. Since the numbers in exchange of goods and services were rising and have been rising with South Korea for a decade now, since the beginning of this free trade agreement, we can expect that they will continue to rise if, let's say, there are proper policies behind. And that's why we should even contribute more to understanding exchange. Everything else, there is the era of artificial intelligence ahead, or we are already in this era of artificial intelligence, digitalization, software engineering, software architecture. There are many different fields where this technology-oriented, highly developed economies, even based on proper state structures, democratically, must work together, and that's what we do with South Korea, and we should intend to continue.
Right. Yes. Maybe you mentioned before the cooperation on COVID during the pandemic on COVID-19, sort of the lessons learned, how South Korea dealt with the pandemic. On the other hand, it seems to me that South Korea at the moment is a little bit behind in terms of vaccination, as much as quite large parts of the world, despite the fact that, Europe has been complaining a lot about deliveries of the vaccines. But, from the global perspective, obviously, we are doing quite well. So do you see any collaboration with South Korea also on this side of the COVID-19? So in terms of producing vaccines, not just sort of providing them with, let's say, those through COVAX, which is more towards the lower income countries, despite the fact South Korea also received some vaccines through COVAX, but more in terms of, sort of providing the world with the vaccines through South Korea.
Absolutely. Let's call it, I want to be frank on that, let's call it a takeaway for me. As mentioned in the beginning of the pandemic, we had several meetings also with colleagues in the European Parliament, and the ambassador of South Korea and other officials did us the favor to talk to us, to convey their experiences with us, and we could use it in our home countries and on a parliamentary level in Brussels. This was of utmost importance and a true sign of friendship from the South Korean side. I'm not aware of any vaccination cooperation or research cooperation on vaccines yet, but I will use this as a takeaway, and I thank you for sharing this thought with me.
Mm-hmm. Yes. There's one question on US-South Korea relations. There was a summit between President Moon and President Biden quite recently. Actually, one takeaway, one outcome of that was US-South Korea cooperation on vaccine production. But there were also other results of that summit. The question from the audience, from Sabine Burkhardt, is about the termination of the revised missile guidelines. Maybe I would also ask more broadly, how do you think that the EU-South Korea cooperation fits with transatlantic relations, or not just transatlantic relations, but let's say also the relations with China? In a way, seems that one of the main lines of the U.S. foreign policy will be how to confront, how to deal with China, and to some extent Europe and South Korea are in sort of similar situation between the two big powers. So how do you also see not just the US-South Korea relationship, but also how the EU can fit within this relationship and the relationship with China?
Well, I guess on a global scale, as we all know, or at least in my view, for many good reasons, the US are the largest partner, the most important partner when it comes to the values also the EU represents on a global scale. And we should talk more to each other. And we do so even since the new administration has started to work on the US side. And I'm really happy about that. We should act more coordinated, even while Europe has to find in many different cases, especially to the outside, so in all fields of foreign policy, its own position and approach and strategy, and become less dependent, which also means to become a better partner for the US. So it's also something the US would have to be in favor of, to have a proper partner, not only, let's say, a partner who follows, which we do in many cases, and we are right about that, but not in each and every case. And this is also true for the Korean Peninsula, because, as mentioned, the EU role can be the one of, even more than of any other entity on this planet, the EU role can be the one of the honest broker. And the US is more involved, which is fine for the US, and which obviously has positive effects on the region. But anyway, the US is more involved for itself and its own interests, and we can contribute more to a better future and better understanding, and that's what we should try to do. And this is also part of what the experts call strategic autonomy for the European Union, to be more capable of conducting our policy to the outside ourselves. So this would be my overall approach. Of course, China plays an enormous important role. Also, Japan is influential historically, but also today. And EU must be not only, as you know, this quote, not only a payer, but also a player. Mm-hmm. And this is especially true for the Korean Peninsula.
Yes. Another result of the recent weeks, let's say, in terms of Korean Peninsula, has been also the Biden administration's DPRK policy review. We still don't know 100% what exactly the review is about, but it looks like that President Biden is trying to sort of find a middle course between, say, the big summit diplomacy of his predecessor, Donald Trump, and at the same time, he doesn't want to go back to President Obama's strategic patience. So it seems that there are sort of suggestions of smaller steps that could be taken. At the same time, it doesn't seem like that North Korea is too much high on his agenda. So, how do you see that? And also, do you have any context with, let's say, the members of the Congress on how to deal with the Korean Peninsula and how to, look at the denuclearization and things like that?
Actually, I have ongoing contacts with congressmen and women from both sides of the aisle. On foreign policy, global policy generally, not that much on the Korean Peninsula, as far as I have it on my mind at the moment. But I will use the opportunities ahead to figure out what the policy points, the main issues from the US side will be under the Biden administration. In my view, Asia generally has a rising importance in US foreign policy, and this will remain under Biden. It already has remained under Biden, and this is also relevant with regard to the Korean Peninsula.
Yes. Yes, thank you. One other question also is, you mentioned your role on the Disinformation Committee. Let's put it this way. What do you think about, let's say, the use of cyber attacks and different, let's say, modern technologies, which it's interesting that, going back to the DPRK, this is a country where citizens don't have access to the internet, and yet they seem to be quite well skilled in all sorts of cyber cyber issues in terms of attacks on different companies and so on. At the same time, South Korea is very well advanced in terms of 5G now. There's a talk of 6G technologies. So how do you see this, cooperation with South Korea on all of these issues, both sort of positive and more negative?
Yeah, that's very clear. We can learn a lot from South Korea due to their ongoing conflict, at least formerly war, with North Korea. They have a high military budget, nearly 4%, I guess. And they are pretty much experienced on things like foreign interference, disinformation, hybrid warfare, cyber attacks. Attempts to divide the society. And that's what we face more and more on a daily basis via hybrid warfare. And let's say the overall South Korean example can convince us not to be naive. And also the means and measures South Korea takes to defend itself against these attempts and attacks and to deal with it are a positive example for dealing with this on a European level, which is of rising importance because of disinformation and all these fields. Let's not forget about, maybe let's say a step aside, but it's anyway interesting. Let's think about the German Bundestag election, which will take place this year. This is a very attractive target for entities and powers which try to influence Europe and to, let's say, deepen conflicts and divide us. They tried to influence the referendum on Brexit. They tried to influence at least the last French presidential election. They were very much engaged into the US elections 5 years ago and 1 year ago for the US president. So not only elections, but also elections are a huge target, and elections are an easy target if you want to split societies politically. And that's why I highly appreciate the means and measures the German state is taking to defend itself, for example, at the moment, inform people about the difference between fake news and news, for example, and how to understand and how to figure that out. So these are fields where South Koreans are far ahead with experience and with knowledge on means and measures, and that's what we can learn from their side.
Yes, so there would be sort of also to end on a positive note. So the last question would be, so what would you like to see in the EU-South Korea relationship and EU-DPRK relationship, let's say, in the next 2-3 years, say, until the end of your mandate? What would you like to achieve in your delegation and you personally, but also what would you like to happen for the EU Korea's relationship in general?
Well, it's a big question, but let's put it that way. When it comes to South Korea, that we will not take our excellent relations and their economic results for granted, but that we work on them each and every day and deepen them via exchange of academics and people generally, and twinning projects, mutual projects, especially in the field of innovation and research and development, and using our opportunities in this excellent relation between the EU and South Korea seems to be extremely important. When it comes to North Korea, I would be more than happy about major steps forward in regard to denuclearization. I would be happy to formally talk to each other again for the first time after 2015, because to talk to each other is always a step forward. There will not take place a reunification under a democratic rule of law based umbrella, of course, in this very mandate in European Parliament, and maybe not in the decade ahead, but at least in the living time of our generation, let's call it that. Let's not be afraid of following also this vision, or at least of explicitly mentioning this vision, because we are used to talk politically and to seek out opportunities and probabilities, but there are real people affected. This generation, the next generation, they are all Koreans, and maybe it happened in history and it can happen in future that major tensions can be overcome, and that's something that also can happen on the Korean Peninsula. And if we would see step by step, little steps forward towards that direction, as you have mentioned during this mandate, I would be more than happy.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for such a nice positive words. We are trying also to contribute both to people-on-people exchanges with South Korea and to see how much we could influence creation of the peace on the Korean Peninsula and dialogue with North Korea as well. Thank you very much for coming, at least virtually. Thank you to everyone who watched this event and who asked questions. Again, thank you very much, Mr. Mandl, and hope to see you soon in person.
Take care. All the best. Stay healthy. Bye-bye. Regards from Brussels.
Thank you.